So I am thrilled to be able to be asking you questions from our audience and a few from me. But I will start with one question that keeps getting circulated by lots of folks, which is about what do we do when the administration doesn't comply with court decisions? So, as you said, we all kind of recognize the moment we're in, but we're still struggling to wrap our heads around what happens if there is not compliance.
Yeah, this is the number one question we get.
Yeah.
I'd say there's a couple answers to it, and I'm sure that there's going to be a follow-on question because there always is. So the first thing is there's defiance and there's defiance. So, and they're routinely defying court orders. They go out of their way to find some loophole. They intentionally misread it. They slow walk compliance, or they kind of just don't do it. That's a first kind of defiance. And that's what sort of happened in our foreign assistance grants case. They just refused to comply the first time. They refused to comply the second time. They imagined loopholes in the judge's order that weren't there. The third time, though, we got an order from the judge that was very clear, and they took it seriously. We know they took it seriously because they didn't, instead of saying, hey, just ignoring it, they immediately appealed to the appellate court and then who refused it, and then immediately to the US Supreme Court. That was the first case of the Trump administration that got to the US Supreme Court. It wasn't obvious we were going to win that. And the issue at the Supreme Court was just, does the government have to follow the order from a district court in context of a temporary restraining order or preliminary injunction? But we did win 5-4, and they did comply. Even then, they slow walked it. They've been slow to pay the money they owed grantees, but they have been and are making the payments. However, also, as I said, we won that legally, and we did force compliance, but they moved to the next phase. Of course, this was not illegal in the sense of complying with the judge. It wasn't defiant in terms of complying with the judge, and just canceled the grants out altogether going forward. Mm-hmm. So that's the reality. That's the first part of this. We can fight this in the courts, and we can actually, if we slog it out, as we're all committed to doing, we can win a lot of these things and eventually hold them to account. Even still, they are so ruthless, norm defiant, and unconcerned with either law or ethics that they may counter next, even after complying, by substantively undoing our victory. Then we got to go after it again. And we're prepared to do that. That's all I think in the first category. It's completely out of the ordinary for any other administration. Completely out of the ordinary. However, it is manageable. As horrible as it is, it's manageable in the context of the legal system. There's just another scenario, which is the Supreme Court issues a decision that's clear, and they don't just misinterpret it. They say, we don't care what the Supreme Court says, we're not following their instructions. And that's really the apocalypse scenario. I'm not sure that's going to happen. I know many of you are going to be confident that it is going to happen. I'm not. Trump himself has repeatedly said he won't do that, or whatever that's worth. There's reasons that they may not do that, including that they've got a really favorable Supreme Court. If they do, again, the first category is super serious. We're working it. We take it very seriously, but it is categorically different than the second. The second thing happens, we've spun up a big network, including with the other two organizations that are part of this trio here, State Democracy Defenders and Democracy Forward, but also including dozens of others, to try to scheme out what can we do? How can we scale up the level of response so that millions and millions of people turn out into the street, so that faith leaders speak out, so that the universities and the academic community all speaks out, so that labor unions are united in saying, no, we demand adherence to the rule of the law. So that the police say, we are law enforcement, you must follow the law, and on and on and on. It's a challenge that we've never faced, really, in the history of the country, at least not since Marbury versus Madison. So it's not like we've got a playbook to go to, but we are trying to scheme around it. And I think we're as prepared as we can be. I also think if it does happen at that level, there will be an instantaneous reaction. So I'm sorry, that's a long answer. I'll be shorter for the rest, but I know that's one that's going to come up again and again, and I thought it's worth.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it's great, because I didn't understand it, and you made it very clear that there really is a connection between enforcing these cases and the public protests. So that's another sort of way that protesting is holding the administration accountable.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. We're getting some questions about actually some of the sort of more technical parts of bringing these cases, like standing issues. Is it hard to find plaintiffs? Like what's your strategy around, which cases to bring and who do you bring them for, on behalf of and all of that?
Yeah, well, let me take the standing part of that first, and I'll talk about the broader strategy part second. So as many of you know, standing is the idea that you can't just bring a case in US federal courts unless you have what's called standing. You have to be a directly impacted party. And the way standing doctrine has evolved in the US over the last, say, 40 years is very hostile to public interest plaintiffs. So corporations that are affected by a government rule, they virtually always have standing because they're directly affected. So it's a clean air rule. The polluter has standing because they're affected. If there's a consumer protection rule that's inadequate, it's not so easy for a consumer group to have standing. And without getting into details, let me just tell you, it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
So the standing challenge is double. One is the courts have made it difficult to establish standing as a legal matter. But even if you figure out who legally should have standing, you actually have to find an affected party that's willing to bring the case. And this is the second problem that we don't normally have, but we absolutely have in a massive way in the Trump administration, which is that people and organizations are scared. They're fearful about the consequences to themselves of bringing lawsuits. So in our case about the foreign assistance grants, there is a big universe of grantees that were being denied their money. They definitely had standing. That was not a hard problem to find who is an affected party. But I can tell you, we talked to 60 organizations, 60, all of whom were affected, some of whom believed, and it's turned out to be true, that they would go out of business if they weren't able to have the funding flow. And 57 of them declined.
Wow.
It's actually exaggerated. A couple of them didn't turn out to be sub-grantees and didn't have standing. But almost all of them did have standing, knew they were affected, desperately wanted the case to go forward, but were frightened for one reason or another. And you can't say it's wrong to be frightened in this administration. Yeah. So that's the reality of the challenge of bringing these cases. Finding affected plaintiffs is a double problem. It's the ongoing problem of satisfying the legal standard, but then the additional problem of finding who's willing to do it. Yeah. In the health space, we've got a lot of cases where doctors or clinics definitely have standing, but they're part of universities, and the universities don't want to bring lawsuits, so they're prohibiting their affiliated clinics or employees from bringing cases. Overall, in terms of the strategy of how to bring these cases, there's a little bit of a question for public citizen, but there's kind of a broader we that does this, because there's a lot of, at this point, there's such desperate need. There's a lot of cross-learning among the different groups, and also some rough allocation of areas or individual cases. If we know State Democracy Defenders is going to do a case, for example, we might do it with them, but we probably won't do it if they're already on it. Occasionally, it makes actually sense as a strategic matter to have multiple cases brought in different jurisdictions. But we're kind of really just looking at the broad range of abuses and trying to digest the torrent of bad things that come from this administration, and then figure out which of them are amenable to legal challenge. Yeah. I gave you a set of categories where we, public citizen, but the other organizations too, have sort of built, okay, this is a category that makes sense. There's other categories around immigrant rights and DEI issues and some civil liberties issues that are especially the purview of the AFL, but I mean the ACLU, but overlapping. There's a category of cases around employment issues for federal workers that we've done a little bit less of. But so there's a set of categories that are amenable. There's a set of things that they're doing that are not really amenable to lawsuits. There are some cases now on the tariffs. That's not, and maybe they'll prevail. It's pretty hard to bring those cases and succeed for reasons that are kind of technical. So we make the assessment of where's there an abuse, and where do we think we've got a legal theory that can remedy the abuse, and where do we have standing? And it's all three of those, because some of them we know out front, like, yeah, there's a problem with what they're doing, but no one has standing to do anything about it, and we're stuck.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you my question because I know your background is in corporate accountability, and you started off by saying the 300 or over 100 investigations that have been dropped against companies, and
Yep.
how friendly the Trump administration is to the private sector. But on the other hand, they're also pressuring the private sector
Yep.
around the way they conduct their business, especially around DEI. And as a longtime DEI professional, I'm just, I would love your thoughts on how unusual that is for the government to try to tell the private sector how to conduct its business in that way. What can you do about that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, the government influences what the private sector does all the time. That's as it should. That's what sort of regulation is mostly. But what's happening right now has, like many other things that from this administration, zero precedent in American history. None. Where they're taking their extreme ideological predispositions and trying to impose it on private sector institutions, whether it's corporations or universities. In some ways, the university stuff far worse. The demands on Harvard, which is now standing up, didn't want to, was forced to stand up because the demands were so extreme and intrusive,
Right.
and violative of the basic fundamental understanding of what it means to be an independent university in a free society. So we're seeing that. We're seeing both explicit and implicit intimidation of corporations to get them to bow down to whatever Trump personally wants. The moment where all those tech moguls were at the inauguration and made a decision that they should ally with Trump, not versus fight him, but ally with Trump versus maintain their own institutional integrity and the vows that they said had since their founding, all those companies had said since their founding they were committed to. Those are the most powerful individuals in the corporate sector in the world, and the most powerful corporations in the world. And they bow down to Trump out of fear. There's never been anything like that. And that moment set a horrific precedent for every other corporate actor. These law firms making these deals, also horrific, violative of all their kind of core alleged principles and their duty to the law and so on. But they're small-time actors compared to Apple or Google or Facebook. There's no precedent for this, and it is really, really serious. And part of what we have to do. I'm not so excited about the idea of appealing to corporations to speak out against this administration because I just don't see them doing it. But we have to hold them accountable for bowing down to the administration. And I don't want to go on and on about this, but there's too many instances of that happening to enumerate right now, and it is really, really dangerous. When the most powerful institutions, the most powerful people in the country and in the world demonstrate their fear and quiescence, it's a pretty bad example for the rest of humans.
Right.
Say, hey, we're going to have courage and stand up.
Okay, so I want to thank you for that. I want to shift to sort of what's coming in the near term. We have some questions about your thoughts on the budget and how that's going to play out. A question about this parade on the 14th, June 14th.
Yeah.
But let's start with the budget.
So I am, just to be transparent, I'm not reading the chat. I'm just taking the questions as Ann gives it to me. I assume when we're asking about the budget, you're referring to what's called reconciliation, the tax and budget process.
Yes.
And this is where the core Republican project, this is the most important and really only significant legislation they're going to pass. The core of it is to cut taxes for corporations and billionaires and pay for it in part by slashing Medicaid, slashing food assistance, SNAP benefits, food stamps, and also spend another $150 billion on the Pentagon over and above its $900 billion a year budget. Also to spend $170 million on creating a police state with unbelievably powerful capacity and surveillance and staffing to sweep up immigrants, put them in camps, and then deport them. And also to provide new subsidies to oil and gas and coal mining, and gut the prior advancements of the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's what we're talking about. It's just starting to unfurl now in Washington, D.C. It's going to be the story. I think timeline for those who are following this, Republicans are saying they hope to get it done in the House by Memorial Day. That's a total fantasy. This is going to go on through the summer, probably play out through August or maybe even to September, possibly even later than that. It's the most important thing substantively for their agenda. We're spending a ton of effort on it. Many allied groups trying to defeat it. Republican or Democrats should be lockstep opposed to this, but under reconciliation rules, they can pass it through the Senate with just a majority vote, no filibuster. So it's going to depend on Republicans breaking apart one way or another. Because they're so crazy, they have a lot of internal contradictions. On the one hand, in the House particularly, there are a bunch who are really insistent on cutting the deficit. It doesn't help to give $4 trillion in tax benefits to rich people and corporations if you want to cut the deficit. So they're having a huge problem there. There are also some who are either moderate or at least in districts that are contestable, who are really worried about the impact of Medicaid cuts. Maybe they care about the impact on their people. They definitely care about the impact on their reelection prospects, which are real. So we have a real chance of blowing it up. It's going to take a long time to unfold. It is unbelievably cruel. It is insane policy, and going to be super important for us all to mobilize around. And there should, and you hear me describe what we're talking about: tax cuts for the rich and billionaires, paid for in part by slashing healthcare benefits and food support for the most vulnerable people. There's no constituency for that. And there's no constituency for that among the Trump base. So there's a real ability potentially to break through on this if we can find the right way to get through the information bubbles that surround the MAGA world.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you think that there is hope, to put pressure against this reconciliation. The other thing that people are very worried about is whether there will be free and fair elections.
Yeah.
So can you tell us sort of how you're thinking about that, especially, next year for the midterms?
All we can do is keep pushing. I mean, there's a couple of things to that. One are, do they put rules in place that undermine the legitimacy, the actual practicality? So in the House, they've passed something called the SAVE Act, which is designed to make it way harder to vote and strip millions of people of their right to vote. I think there's no chance of that getting through the Senate unless they do extraordinary measures to overcome the filibuster. But we've been actively campaigning against that. And there are many other anti-voter rules that are happening federally, but also in the states. Super important. In some ways, those are the most urgent fights. The other one that's probably on people's minds is the existential question of, well, will they cancel the election altogether or just ignore the results? And, I can't promise you that's not going to happen. I don't think it's likely, but the way to protect against it, as we've seen, as we saw in 2020, is just to mobilize people. It's harder to steal a not close election, but the more people are engaged anyway, the more the process moves forward, the less they can interfere with it, the more we get more certainty we have for getting a fair count and having the results respected. So again, I think a lot of it turns out to mobilizing, which is not just demonstrating, as important as I think that is.
Yeah.
But just people engaging as much as possible. High voter turnout means much less likelihood of them trying to cancel an election or claim the votes don't really matter or anything like that.
Okay, great. Well, I mean, that's, you know, that's a lot of what we do at Force Multiplier is support groups that are on the ground doing that. Okay, so what about these judges? The way that Trump has been pressuring and you know, edging towards, like, I don't want to say, I mean, well, the question here is violence against judges, like threatening judges. Any thoughts on?
I don't have anything great around that. I mean, I think the judges are gonna they're pretty serious people, and I think they're gonna do their job. They're gonna resist the intimidation. But you know, human beings are human beings. So it makes a big difference, and it's important for us to not, as an aside, the likelihood of impeaching judges is close to zero. So that's one piece of this, but that's very, very unlikely. But the intimidation is, you know, I think what's important is that we don't let it be normalized. That we continue to call it out, and that diminishes it a little bit. I worry, one of the, you know, we've all observed this over now having lived through the first Trump term and now this one. His and his administration's behavior is so egregious and so relentless that things that you get properly worked up about 3 years ago, you just get used to, and you don't take it seriously anymore. I mean, in that example I gave of the corruption at the top of the remarks, you know, they've normalized corruption to such an extent that even though it's literally 100 times worse this term, it's not getting a tenth the attention it did in the first term. We just can't let them normalize the attacks on judges and the implicit and occasionally explicit threats against judges and other public servants.
Yeah, and as an extension of that, Arlene is asking more and more, it seems like the words pro-democracy and anti-authoritarian are being treated as partisan. And I know you've done, or Public Citizen has done work around like disinformation and on, you know, the media platforms and stuff, but how do we, you know, how do we reclaim those and make sure that they don't end up sort of being just part of their, you know, attacks on what we're trying to safeguard, which is our democracy.
Yeah, I mean, we're in an Orwellian period where the contest over words and their meaning are completely different than anything we've ever experienced. I don't think there's magic answers. I do think that we can pierce through some of the lies when we tell stories. And so sometimes, you know, you got my bio, no surprise, I'm excited by the world of ideas. But when we can distill the ideas down to practicalities, I think that can cut through. So very specifically, you know, the illegal and improper and now acknowledged mistaken arrest of Kilmer Abrego Garcia, that's cut through. And that story, we haven't solved it. We haven't got him home. But that story has reached people, and it's changed the debate on immigration, which is Trump's probably strongest thing and the Democrats' weakest thing. So that there's now a majority of the public who oppose his immigration policies. And that's probably the number one reason. Just like in the first administration, the family separation, the visual images and the concreteness of that cut through the high level talk, both their lies and sort of generic lies, but also our kind of appeal to principle. It became very real for people. And I think that's really important for us to come back to again and again. So when we talk about democracy, which I would assume all of us on this call find motivating per se,
Right.
that we don't just rely on that. It should be motivating per se. We don't need to apologize for that. And we should never retreat from that. but also to explain what it means to have either a working democracy or not. You know, what we get with a democracy that's responsive to what people want, or whether we don't. And when you sort of line it up, like, okay, people care 92%, they want to reduce drug prices. Like, what? Why don't we get it? Well, because the democracy is not working. If we have the working democracy, we get lower drug prices. If we don't, we don't. It kind of translated in ways that people can understand it matters directly, not just as a matter of moral principle.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And I know, speaking of drug prices, I have it from a reliable source that was one of the first things you did when you graduated from law school. Before you got into all this corporate accountability stuff. So tell us that story, because I think it's very inspiring.
It is a good story. It is a corporate accountability story.
Well, I guess that's true. It is.
So this is in the 1990s, and I can't see all of you, but it appears that most of you do remember the 1990s on this call. So, you know, the AIDS epidemic had become a global phenomenon, and really shifted primarily out of the United States into the developing world, and especially was focused on Africa. We had the first treatments start to come online in the late 80s, and then by the early 90s, we had triple drug therapy available, antiretroviral therapy, that converted AIDS from a death sentence into a chronic disease that people could live with. And that became real immediately in the United States. But meanwhile, it remained a death sentence in Africa. And the reason was that the drugs weren't available. And the reason the drugs weren't available is the combination drugs cost $10,000 a year per person. That's what they cost in the United States. And they cost the same thing in Africa, because they were patent protected and owned by primarily US drug, but multinational drug corporations. And they didn't change the price for poor countries versus what they were paying, what they were demanding in rich countries. They could do that because of their patent monopolies. So long story short, we challenged the patent monopolies. We identified a drug manufacturer in India that could make the drugs that were being charged $10,000 or more per year per person for, at first, $350 a year per person. So from 10,000 to 350. And that broke things open in a huge way. That affordable price led the Bush administration to the Bush II administration to create the PEPFAR program, the President's Emergency Program for AIDS relief. And that provided funding that even the Bush people, who were supported by evangelicals on this, said, well, if we can do it affordably, we want to save people's lives. Long story short, the drugs are now less than $100 a year per person. There's 25 million people on treatment around the world. Basically, all of them would be dead if they weren't able to get this treatment. And none of them, virtually none of them, would get the treatment if the price had still been at the monopoly level and hadn't dropped down to 1% or less of what it originally was. So it's an amazing, really positive story. There weren't that many of us that worked on it. So it's something, yeah, I'm immensely proud of. To bring it to the present day, however, that program, PEPFAR, is now under assault from this administration, even though it's a Bush administration created program, rooted in evangelical support, consistent bipartisan support since its creation. Now it's really in jeopardy as they're massive scaling back humanitarian aid. And the budget they just proposed, which is now not reconciliation with their budget for the next fiscal year, it's vague what they say they want to do. They say all recipients will continue to get PEPFAR money, but we don't know. It's definitely in jeopardy. And if the money doesn't flow, this life-saving work will come to a halt, even though we've managed to reduce the prices and make it, in the term of the day, very efficient to save people's lives in Africa.
Right. Well, it's an amazing story. And again, something that, we have to fight to protect, I guess. Yeah. And the more stories we tell, the better. So we only have another minute or so. I do want to ask, because I have a couple of questions about what we can do about this parade and if there's any way, to prevent it.
Yeah, so we're asking about the parade on June 14th, the military parade that Trump
Yes.
to have on Pennsylvania Avenue.
Right.
I think it appears that it's going to happen. And I think that was certainly the case in the first term, but the Pentagon itself found it distasteful and didn't want it,
Right.
and they kind of maneuvered to block it.
Mhm.
It doesn't seem like that's going to happen this time, and I don't think there's any external thing we can do around it. That happens to be the same day that we're going to have this mass mobilization I'm mentioning around the country. We're probably not going to have any activity in Washington, D.C. because we don't want to be engaged in a counter protest to a military parade that's just asking for too much trouble. Those who are asking probably know June 14th, it happens to be Flag Day, for whatever that's worth, but it's also Trump's birthday, which is absolutely why they're having it on that day. So it is, there are democratic countries, as he saw in France, that have military parades of this nature with displays of weaponry. But by and large, this is a signature feature of authoritarian nations displaying their military might, not just to show how great we the people are, but to show we the people, if you get out of line, this is what we can deploy against you. So I share the sentiment that I assume is being expressed of horror at this, and I'm not sure we can do anything to stop it.
Well, okay, but we can protest, and we will be telling our whole community to get out there too. So
That's
I
right.
think,
Everywhere else, we have an answer, which is celebrate, get on the streets and protest authoritarianism, not bow down before it as the missiles go down Pennsylvania Avenue. But thank you all. We absolutely need and super appreciate all your support. But it's it's the big we that's going to make the difference in this, not just our staff here. So it's all together. Thank you so much.
We're proud to be supporting you and working with you. Thank you.
we thank you so much for everything you're doing. You give us hope.